great warmth washing over me.
Towel!
I think the sky's on fire.
Please don't die. Caroline, he's dying.
Press!
He's turning blue.
In part 1 of our Wolfenstein story recaps, we briefly covered some important events from Return to Castle Wolfenstein, Wolfenstein 2009, and Wolfenstein The Old Blood, before going over the entire plot of Wolfenstein The New Order in detail. In this second and final part of this series, we'll be recapping the entire story of Wolfenstein 2 The New Colossus before speaking a bit about the setup of the upcoming Youngblood. When the new Colossus begins, BJ's in the worst shape he's been in his entire life, and considering the fact that this is a man who was vegetative for 14 years until very recently, that's saying a lot. But let's rewind a little, because when we left things off at the end of the New Order, he was at the verge of death, lying in Death's Head's compound, having just told his friends in a ship to nuke the place to hell. But of course, knowing that he was still in the fortress, they weren't going to do that. Led by Anya, the Resistance members re-enter the compound, find the half-dead BJ, and manage to get him back onto their stolen U-boat. And only once they've done that do they fire a nuclear missile on Death's Head's fortress, finally accomplishing the mission that they set out for. Following this, the game takes a bit of a time jump. For 6 months, BJ lies in a coma, having been wrecked by his fatal injuries. In these 6 months, BJ has also become something of a notorious figure throughout the world. His attack on Death's Head's fortress has led to the global Nazi leadership decreeing him as a terrorist, dubbing him Terror Billy, and he has officially become the most wanted terrorist in the world. Terror Billy himself, however, has seen much better days. His body is failing, his organs fluctuating, and it's becoming clear that he doesn't have long left. As he slips in and out of consciousness, he also finds out that Anya is pregnant with twins. BJ's rest, if you want to call it that, is cut short, however. 6 months after the events of the first game, the ship is attacked by Frau Engel, which is essentially an airborne fortress called the Ausmerzer. BJ wakes up during the attack, but heavily injured and crippled as he still is, with his legs no longer working anymore, he climbs onto a wheelchair and sets out to look for Anya. Fighting through the U-boat against invading Nazi soldiers while still bound to his wheelchair, BJ eventually finds both Anya and Set, who brief him on what's going on. Irene Engel, as it turns out, has trapped the ship and prevented it from going anywhere by suspending it with her own airship. Not only that, she's also taken 2 people captive, Caroline and Fergus or Wyatt, depending on which of the 2 is still alive after the beginnings of the New Order. But BJ has a plan to get them back. He gets himself captured by Engel's soldiers, who take him back to the Ausmerzer, where he hopes to rescue Caroline and Fergus or Wyatt, while also releasing the ship from the airship's clutches. When faced directly by Engel, though, who's now horribly scarred thanks to the events of the previous game, things don't turn out exactly as BJ had been hoping. Cornered and captured, things quickly take a turn for the worse. In a tense sequence, we find out the depths of Engel's degeneracy, who's not only a psychotic, radical Nazi leader, which we already knew, but also horrible, abusive, and hateful towards her daughter, Sigrun, who she openly and cruelly mocks in front of BJ and the rest for, among various other things, the size and shape of her body. But that's not the worst thing she does, of course. She also proceeds to behead Caroline, following which she picks up her head and taunts BJ with it. Pushed beyond her limits, Engel's daughter has a change of heart and rams into her mother, which gives Fergus or Wyatt the room to break free and BJ to grab Caroline's power suit and put it on. Equipped with the suit, BJ fights and kills Engel's Nazi soldiers, even though Engel herself manages to escape. With Sigrun's help, BJ and Fergus or Wyatt manage to detach the ship from the Ausmerzer and make it back to their ship, fleeing from Engel's airship fortress. Afterward, a funeral is held for Caroline, following which the Resistance regroups to figure out its next move. With Caroline, their leader, now dead, they wonder what direction to head in next, but ultimately decide that they'll proceed with the mission she had decided would be the next step for them: to free the United States of America from Nazi control and use the nation as their base for fighting against the Reich on a global scale. Discovering the location of a fractured resistance group, BJ, now equipped with the power suit and thus able to walk and better yet, fight in spite of his ailing and fragile body, heads to New York City. The city was bombarded with atom bombs by the Nazis in 1948, which is what forced the United States into surrendering, and here, atop the ruins of the Empire State Building, is where they've been able to pinpoint the location of the local resistance group. Protected by the radiation on the ground thanks to his power suit, BJ makes his way through the ruins of New York, eventually making it to the top of the Empire State, where he meets these local resistance members. They are Grace Walker, her infant child, and a conspiracy theory nut called Super Spesh. Though initially suspicious of BJ, the two of them ultimately decide to trust him. Before they can proceed forward with anything else, the building is attacked by a group of Nazi soldiers. After BJ fends them off, he, Grace, and Super Spesh get on board a helicopter to fly back to the ship. On their ride, after BJ tells them what he's planning to do, Grace tells him of the absolute control the Nazis and other radical groups such as the Ku Klux Klan exert over America, saying that the American people themselves have all but given up. BJ, however, convinces her, expressing his belief that a successful revolution can still be organized. Grace and Super Spesh agree to join him and the resistance in their efforts. Instantly joining as the de facto leader of the group, Grace comes up with the first thing that they need to do in order to liberate the United States, and her first mission is a doozy. She tells them that a huge chunk of the Nazi leadership can be found in the Oberkommando over in Roswell, New Mexico, close to one of the biggest unearthed .Yickend vaults that probably explains why they're there. Grace's plan? To blow up the place and cripple the Reich's leadership in America. Dressed as a fireman, BJ hides a portable nuclear warhead in his fire extinguisher and heads to the city, where he is to rendezvous with Super Spesh, who can show him a safe passage into Oberkommando. In Roswell, Super Spesh leads BJ to a tunnel that leads right into Oberkommando. After sneaking and fighting his way through the tunnel and into the facility, BJ places the warhead in its core, hijacks a motorcycle from a Nazi soldier, flees and escapes, detonating the bomb and in doing so destroying Oberkommando and a huge chunk of Nazi leadership in the United States. While heading back though, he doesn't go straight home. He takes a detour and heads to his childhood home in Mesquite, Texas. Here, through flashbacks, BJ's tragic childhood is revealed. When he was a boy, both BJ and his mother lived in fear of his horribly abusive father, who, as it turns out, shared a lot of the same ideologies that the eventual Nazi reign over America would subscribe to as well. In the present, when BJ arrives at the ramshackle and rundown remains of his childhood home, he picks up a family heirloom, a ring that belonged to his mother, which he intends to give to Anya. It turns out, though, that he isn't alone here. Rip Blaskowicz, BJ's father, appears, shaming him for his actions. Clearly, he buys into the Terror Billy narrative that has been spun by Nazi leadership throughout the world. He tells BJ that he gave up his mother to the Nazis to become a victim of their Holocaust, who rewarded him for his loyalty, and now he intends to deliver BJ to them as well. BJ cuts that plan short, though, and kills his father. But as it turns out, Frau Engel, thanks to his father's open telephone line, now knows exactly where BJ is. Immediately, the location is swarmed by her soldiers, and though BJ tries to fight his way out of the situation, he is quickly overwhelmed. Engel captures BJ once again and takes his mother's ring for herself, just for kicks. From here on out, things only go from bad to worse. While BJ is being held by Engel, Super Spesh visits him under the guise of his lawyer, telling him that he and the others are coming up with a plan to break him out. As he's leaving, though, Engel kills him, telling BJ that she knew who he was and why he was there the moment he stepped into the building. Shortly afterward, in front of the Lincoln Memorial, in front of a crowd of thousands in an event that is televised live, Engel executes BJ by chopping off his head with an axe and then throwing it into a furnace hundreds of feet below. No, seriously, but don't worry, BJ doesn't die. So how, you might ask? How does a man who's been beheaded and whose detached head has then been thrown into a furnace manage to still come out of all of that alive? Well, Wolfenstein as a series has been known to do some pretty bizarre, ridiculously over-the-top stuff at times, and it's fair to say that what happens next fits that description pretty well. As Engel throws BJ's head into the furnace, before it can hit the surface, it's caught by a drone operated by Set, while the other members of the Resistance quickly replace it with another head. On camera, it appears very much like it was still BJ's head that fell into the fire. And what exactly does Set do with BJ's head? Well, he oxygenates it and preserves it in a glass tank, where it manages to still show brain activity. Shortly afterward, Set surgically attaches BJ's head to the body of a bioengineered Nazi super soldier that Caroline had managed to capture while she was still alive. And so, BJ comes back from the dead, only now he's stronger than ever. All of his previous ailments are gone thanks to his new body, and Nazi-killing machine Terror Billy is now even more of a threat with his bioengineered super soldier body, to the extent where he doesn't even need the power suit anymore. From here, the Resistance formulates its next step, which is to break into New Orleans and gather up even more freedom fighters to join their cause. New Orleans, it seems, has been transformed into a completely walled-off ghetto city, where the Nazis send all the people they deem as undesirables. Here, the Resistance has located an anarchist rebel group that is led by communist Horton Boone. After fighting through hordes of Nazi in New Orleans, BJ managed to find Horton and his fighters. In an especially bizarre and awesome scene, one of Horton's soldiers has a sniper rifle firefight with Nazi soldiers outside, all while another of Horton's followers plays clarinet in the background. While this is going on, Horton and BJ argue over the validity of his plans to organize America's revolution for liberation from Nazi rule, all while getting increasingly more intoxicated. In the shouting match that follows between the two of them, BJ is able to convince Horton and his ragtag band of followers to join the Kreisau Circle, after which they all flee from New Orleans and head back to the ship. When they get back, after everyone has been acquainted with each other, Horton tells them that there is one thing that stands between them and their plans to liberate the USA from Nazi control: Frau Engel and her ship, the Ausmerzer. He tells them that any revolutions or rebellions would be promptly quashed by the airship, and that in the past it used to go from city to crash any attempts at revolts. So if they are to drive the Nazis out of America, they're going to need to make sure the Ausmerzer doesn't get in their way, for which they need to capture it. But that's easier said than done. Not just because it's a heavily fortified ship defended by the most dangerous and deadly Nazi tech and forces, or because it's a literal airborne fortress. No, the biggest threat that they would face if they attempted to hijack the Ausmerzer would be an automated orbital defense system known as Odin, which would quickly put an end to all of their plans. So if they are to capture the Ausmerzer, first they need to gain control of Odin. And how do they do that? Well, Odin's codes rest within Oberkommando, but since BJ blew up their base in Roswell, New Mexico, they moved to a location that might be slightly harder to reach: Venus. Yep, Venus. So you thought going to the moon was crazy. Well, you ain't seen nothing yet. But getting to Venus and infiltrating a heavily defended Nazi base to steal Odin codes and then making it back to the Earth is going to be no easy task, even for a Nazi killing machine like BJ. Conveniently enough, an opportunity presents itself that might allow him to do just that. Following the death of Terror Billy, the Reich commissioned a biopic film chronicling their valiant efforts to bring him down and how they succeeded in putting a stop to his heinous terrorist activities. It's propaganda, essentially, produced by Adolf Hitler himself. Luckily enough, though, they're holding auditions for the role of William B.J. Blazkowicz. You can probably guess where this is going. The Kreisau Circle captures an actor named Jules Redfield, who was scheduled to audition for BJ's role. Assuming his identity, BJ heads to Venus to audition. Once he gets to Venus, things get a little weird. Even weirder. In a particularly outlandish scene, BJ and a couple of other actors auditioned for the role of Terror Billy, and they audition in front of none other than Adolf Hitler himself, who's turned into a psychotic, ailing, paranoid old man who throws up, pisses, screams like a madman, bursts into tears, boasts about his victories, kills one of the actors for no good reason, and then ultimately goes to sleep right there on the floor, all within the space of 5 minutes. After that particularly weird audition, BJ, who has somehow managed to keep his cover intact, is able to get to the real task at hand: getting those Odin codes. As you may have guessed it, things quickly take a violent turn. BJ shoots, stabs, and sneaks his way through Nazi soldiers and defenses until he eventually manages to break into the facility's heart and steals the Odin codes, following which he heads back to Earth to get them decoded. And so, as the Kreisau Circle hijacks Odin and brings it under their control, BJ launches an assault onto the Ausmerzer, fighting through hordes of Nazis and some of their fiercest machines and defenses. After intense firefights and some particularly glorious over-the-top scenes, their assault ends in success, with the Ausmerzer firmly in their control. Finally, the Resistance heads back to the surface to confront Frau Engel. While all of this is going on, Engel has been in a studio for a live event on national television, which is where BJ comes into the scene, quite literally. As Engel rages over having killed BJ, fittingly enough, he drives a hatchet into her head to kill her on live television. At this point, Grace and Horton turn to the camera and speak to the nation at large, rousing them to rise up and fight back against the Nazis, and to take to the streets and drive out their oppressors. As they declare the revolution in America having kicked off, the screen cuts to black, with snippets during the credits showing revolts and riots taking place across the country, with massive insurrections attempting to drive out the Nazis. In a post-credits scene, BJ takes his mother's ring off of Engel's corpse and proposes to Anya. And that's where the new Colossus ends. Before we get to the pivotal sequel with Wolfenstein 3 though, Machine Games are taking a bit of a detour with the upcoming Youngblood telling something of a side story. The game is set in 1980, 2 decades after the events of Wolfenstein 2, and things have certainly changed. For starters, BJ is no longer the leading man, he's on break for this one, which means that stepping into the leading roles are Jessica and Sophia, the twin daughters of BJ and Anya. After BJ goes MIA, Jess and Sophia, with the help of Grace's daughter Abby, head out to look for their father. His trail leads them to Paris, still occupied by the Nazis, and it falls to them to not only track down BJ and bring him home and figure out why he left in the first place, but also fight alongside the French resistance and drive the Nazis out of Paris. It's a curious game, that's for sure. The massive time jump poses dozens of questions, not just about what happened in the interim, but also about how crucial Youngblood itself is going to be to the larger series being told, and just where Wolfenstein 3 is going to fit into all of this. We do know that some characters are returning, such as Anya and Grace, while BJ also has to be there in some capacity. We've already seen a glimpse of him in one of the trailers. How it all pans out is something that remains to be seen, but owing simply to the fact that it is a Wolfenstein game, we are incredibly excited to slay some more Nazis. And that about does it for this video. If you enjoyed what you watched and want to see more from GamingBolt, you can always hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell icon next to it. That way you will never miss any of our videos.